Hey there, I wanted to take a brief moment and welcome you to the Focus Point podcast. If this is one of the first episodes that you're hearing from us, please head over to our website, thepointoffocus.com, where you can find out some more information about who we are, what we're doing. You can also find other podcast episodes and blog posts there as well. That's thepointoffocus.com. I'm so glad that you decided to give one of our episodes a listen. I really hope that you will be blessed and encouraged through what you hear in this episode. I also encourage you to share this episode with your family and your friends. Once again, I just thank you for taking some time and listening to our episode. Now, let's dive in to today's episode. Well, we are continuing on in our annual At the Movies series that we've called Inside Out. This is episode 4 of that series, and I'm excited to continue along. This year we're doing it a little bit different. This year we're looking at one specific movie and the characters within that movie, where in the past we typically look at a handful of different movies and see what God has to say to us in those movies, because we and other ministry leaders believe that God speaks through anything as long as we're willing to listen, as long as we're listening for God's voice. His primary source is the Bible, obviously, but he'll speak through other people. He'll speak through songs and billboards and movies, as long as we're listening. You know, when we pray and we ask God for stuff, we have to look for his response, whether it's in the Bible or sometimes you'll be walking along and you'll hear somebody say something that's not even directed at you, but it's kind of like, it feels like God talking to you, or you'll see a billboard or listen to a song, or you'll hear a movie, something in a movie, right? And the thing is that it doesn't have to be like Christian music or something like that. You can hear it in a Taylor Swift song, or in a song by the Foo Fighters or Linkin Park or whatever. You can hear it in the movies and different billboards for a dentist office or whatever. Their slogan might speak to you or might answer in a way for you to hear God. We just really mainly have to be listening for it. And so we've done this we've done this At the Movies series annually. And this year, like I said, we decided to do a little bit different. We decided to look at one specific movie. It's one of my favorite movies. It's one of my kids' favorite movies, and that movie's Inside Out. In the past, like I've said, we've done a handful of different movies, but we just did Christmas at the movies. So I thought it was cool to kind of change it up here and talk about the different emotions and the characters, if you will, in the movie Inside Out. And so, where we've been over the last 3 episodes, last week we dove into embarrassment or shame or guilt, right? We dove into that idea. And while guilt isn't wrong, because typically when we feel guilty or we feel a certain kind of way, it's because the Holy Spirit is convicting us of something that we've done wrong. But there is another kind of guilt that the devil uses to make us less productive, if you will, or more apt to kind of be ashamed of ourselves and all of that. And that's the kind of stuff that we talked about. And we looked at the story that kind of set all of these emotions that we now feel into motion. We looked at Adam and Eve, the very first story in the Bible, other than creation and God. You know, this was like one of the first major stories that people go to. And we looked at it and we answered the question, who told you that? And we looked at how God was not confused, but God was asking Adam after he said, hey, we were afraid, we were ashamed, right? And so they hid. And so God's like, well, who told you that you needed to feel that way? And we talked about how the devil uses these different things where he trips us up. And we looked at the temptation of Jesus and how how the devil attacked Jesus right where he was weak. The story starts how Jesus was hungry, and the first temptation that the devil gives was food. So he hits us right where we're weak, and if we cave to it, then the devil goes, ha, see, you're no better than you were before. You're trying to kick this habit. You're trying to not look at this. You're trying not to do that. But you keep falling into that addiction. You keep falling into yelling at your spouse. You're just like your parents were in your parenting. You're trying to be better, but you're really not. and that's exactly what God is asking here. With the devil now has tempted them, and they now know good and evil, and now they're saying, oh, well, we were ashamed because we were naked, and we were afraid, so we hid. And God is like, who told you that? And then, so we kind of unpacked that a little bit. And you can go back and listen to any of these episodes in our archives. And then a couple weeks ago, we talked about fear. And we talked about how fear is a killer. And we talked about how fear kills our dreams and our hopes and our progress and whatever. And sometimes the most dangerous thing that I think fear kills, and it kind of scared me, is what does fear take from us that we don't even know it's taking? But then we talked about 2 Timothy 1:7 and how God didn't give us a spirit of fear. God has given us power. God has given us power over fear. So God has something different to say about fear, that fear isn't a killer. Fear is dead by the power of Jesus. And fear is not from God. And so we talked about how to overcome that, because God has given us the power. And we looked at David and Goliath and how Israel was just paralyzed with fear because of the Philistines, and they weren't going to do anything about it. And they weren't going to see the victory that God had for them because they were afraid. But then David came in and killed Goliath, and they were able to see that God had given them victory, and all they had to do was go into battle. And the very first episode of the series, we looked at anger, and not like how to combat anger. Everybody gets angry, and anger forms in many different ways, right? Anger isn't just the words that we use, or the things that we say, like the things that we say, or anything like that. Anger comes from a lot of different kind of emotions, and it shows up in our actions, it shows up in the words that we use, and in other things. So it shows because we're stressed out, or because we're afraid, or anything, right? It shows up in many different scopes. And we looked at not how to just stop being angry, but we looked at Ephesians 4:26-32, and we looked at these different things that Paul says to get rid of. Get rid of these things and be kind and compassionate. And so and we've kind of put all of this series so far into a couple theme verses, but mainly in Philippians. We started off the year by looking at the book of Philippians, and we went through section by section, verse by verse, through the book of Philippians earlier this year in a series called I've Got the Joy. And you can check that out too. But one of the theme verses for this series, Inside Out, is, "For I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength." And it is so important that when we look at anger, when we look at fear, when we look at embarrassment and shame and all of that, well, God gives us the strength to get through those. God gives us the strength to control our anger and to look at different things and how we... And I said to do an exercise, right? Where are some things that you find yourself the most irritable, where you get the most angry, and all of that. And so, and to break those things down and to see if that can help you become less angry, or figure out a way to step aside or cool off or whatever. So today we are diving into one of the newer characters in the most recent movie, Inside Out 2. And we're looking at boredom, or ennui, as they said in the movie. And boredom doesn't have a big role, but it almost presents in the movie as like depression and just uncaring, lack of motivation, just kind of like, And so when you look at a definition of boredom, it says boredom is the emotional or physical state one experiences due to lack of mental stimulation, activities to do, interest in one's surroundings, or interest in the activities, or whatever. Right? I experience boredom. Kids experience boredom, but we typically, when kids say it, we typically want to go, oh well, you've got all this stuff. Like, I hear it in my house all the time. I'm bored. I'm bored. I'm bored. And this isn't when we're at, like, a doctor's office. Like, when I have to take especially my youngest son, when I have to take him with me somewhere, like to a doctor's appointment or whatever, sometimes you just got to do that as a parent. And you'll hear, I'm bored, because, they're just sitting there. There's really nothing for them to do, right? But when we're at home, it tends to, especially my wife and I, like when we hear the words, I'm bored, or when we heard it growing up, when we said the words, I'm bored, typically you get a response from your parents that is like, well, why are you bored? You've got all these toys that you never play with. You got a whole basement full of toys. You got a room full of this. You got all these things to do and all. But when I look at this definition of boredom, it's not because they have things to do. It's because they've already done those things, or maybe they're just bored with those particular things. And it kind of makes me think about the different ways to combat boredom, right? And I experienced it recently. Like, I just recently got a PS5. I upgraded. I don't do video games very much anymore like I used to, and that's not the point of this. Oh, we got a PS5. That's not the point of it, right? The point is that one day I was sitting there, and I've got games for it, and every once in a while I can get some free games or some very, very discounted games, right? And so I'm sitting there, and I'm just like, this is, what do I got here? Like, I'm like, I don't even want to do that. Or I don't want to, like, I was just bored. Like, it just kind of attacked me. Like, wow, I've got all these different games to try and different games to play. Some of them I've been wanting for a while, and I wanted to upgrade for a little bit so I could get some newer games that aren't on PS4 and all of this stuff like that. And I'm sitting there and I'm looking, and I'm bored with it. Or we're sitting there flicking through Netflix or Disney Plus, and maybe our boredom comes from a lot of things to do. Too much, right? Maybe lends to our boredom because we just like, well, I don't really want to scroll through all of this stuff, or I don't want to do that, or I don't really feel like it, right? Boredom, though, is not a sin, okay? We will all experience boredom. Being just kind of just not motivated or whatever isn't a sin, right? It's not a problem really, because it's just we're gonna experience it eventually. We're bored with this part of our house, and so what do? We typically shape it up, or we repaint it, or we do different things, or like I'm bored with the job, or all of this stuff. And sometimes boredom kind of like stays, or it goes away, it comes and goes, and all of that, right? We all experience boredom at some different level, but attitudes and choices that lead to or arise from boredom may be harmful to a Christian's faith. May be harmful to not necessarily a Christian, but harmful to anybody, right? We're focused on that, but what if you're talking to somebody that's not a follower of Jesus and they're bored, or somebody's listening to me right now who's not a follower of Jesus? Our choices, right, is what comes. So what we do in our boredom is important. I forgot to tell you this a second ago, but if you have a copy of the Bible, we're going to open it on up right now. Whether that copy's paper or electronic, get the Bible in front of you, and we're going to be in 2 Samuel chapter 11. And I meant to say this earlier, so it gives you less time to kind of look for it, but this is one of the only stories, and I know people will combat me with this, but it's not important. One of the only things that you could kind of see boredom in the Bible, other than different like laziness, and that's a whole nother kind of thing. Proverbs has a lot in there about the ants and the being lazy and not having what you need. But boredom isn't necessarily laziness, right? If you're being lazy and that's why you're bored, well, okay, well, that's a whole nother kind of thing. But boredom in itself, you're enjoying your life, and all of a sudden, just kind of like you sit down one day and you're kind of like, I don't know what to do. I've done all of these things. I've played with all of these things. I've watched these movies multiple times. Like, I've played these games. Like, and you get bored, right? But if you're just sitting on the couch and you just go, oh, I don't want to do that. I'm just bored. Nah. And that's the way the movie Inside Out 2 kind of depicts this boredom character, where he gets asked to do it, like, or like, whatever. He's got the control panel, right, on his phone, so he doesn't have to get up to go help what the emotions do, right? They do different things to help Riley, right? And he doesn't have to get up. And so boredom, when out of laziness, is a different kind of thing. But if it's bored because, like, you've done things, it's that idea of activities to do or different things like that, or interest in the activities. It's not that you want to be lazy, it's just that you're trying to find something to do, right? So when I look at this, and you could even say Adam and Eve, but we just looked at Adam and Eve, but I will reference them a little bit later. But when I was sitting there and I asked a couple different people this, when you have boredom, what are some stories in the Bible that come to mind when I say the word boredom? And one of the main stories that came up is this story in 2 Samuel chapter 11 with David and Bathsheba. And it's not a typical Sunday school story, okay? And we're not going to look at all of it, but we're not going to read all of it. Let's put it that way. We're going to paraphrase and talk about the other components of it, but we're going to just read this initial part, the first 4 verses. And we're going to get the idea of the possibility of boredom here. And so this will, hopefully you're there, 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1, and it says, in the spring of the year, okay, so this was now their summertime, right? This was not, war didn't happen in the winter, okay, so this was like the beginning of their opportunity, and it was March or April, okay? It wasn't a time that they did typical battles. So it was like, the battles would get put on hold during this time. And so we kind of like a truce. Kind of like, hey, it's snowing now, so let's just put things on hold, right? Raining or cold, not necessarily snow, but you get what I'm saying, okay? So in the spring of the year, when kings normally go out to war, so this indicates that this is now a restart, David sent Joab and the Israelite army to fight the Amorites. They destroyed the Amorite army and laid siege to the city of Rabbah. However, David stayed behind in Jerusalem. That is one of the key components of boredom that can happen. Maybe you choose to, like, maybe you're offered the choice, right? We offer our kids choice. Like, do you want to come with me or do you want to stay here? And sometimes it's like, okay, or maybe you're supposed to be somewhere and you're not, and you wind up like David here, bored. I can't get past the fact that this is what's happening. He's not where he's supposed to be. He's been home for quite some time, right? And now nobody's there with him really because he sent people to war. And it doesn't indicate that there's people in the palace with him or like where he's at necessarily. So then it says, verse 2, it says, late one afternoon, after his midday rest, so once again, he's kind of like, maybe that's, I got nothing to do, let's take a nap. I don't know, maybe you're reading too much into this, and I know people will probably get all upset about it, but you know what? This is how you're supposed to read the Bible, I believe. These stories have underlying things that could be a possibility. So after David got out of bed and was walking on the roof of the palace. As he looked over the city, he noticed a woman of unusual beauty taking a bath. He sent someone to find out who she was and was told she is Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, the Hittite. Uriah is interesting. We're going to talk about him in just a second. Then David sent messengers to go get her, and when the king calls for you, you come. It's not a game to be played. And when she came to the palace, he slept with her. Then she returned home. So it's almost kind of like, takes two to tango. A lot of people, when they, and one of the people that I was talking about this particular story, and that's really all we're going to read. We are going to kind of, like I said, talk about the rest of the story. But right here, at this point, okay, it takes two to tango, okay? It takes two to involve yourself, and it doesn't indicate here that she was forced in any kind of abusive kind of situation. But some of the people that I was talking to, one in particular, hinted at the fact that, we give David a lot of grief here. Now, more so not because this moment, but because of his subsequent moments that happen in this story. Okay? And it's also stemming from David having a problem with lust and all of this stuff, and taking on wives that he wasn't supposed to, right? God hadn't designed marriage to be this way. And at this point, people are taking on multiple wives. Solomon did it. All these different kings have done it, and he hasn't been able to get that in key, right? Remember, the devil tempts you at your weakest point, right? So we're seeing all of this kind of unfold in the series that we're in. Inside Out was kind of mapped this way, as these all kind of build on each other and kind of come back with each other, right? So this idea of being bored and this idea of being tempted, okay? But it was recently said, as I said in this, that Bathsheba wasn't necessarily innocent, right? She was out in the open, taking a bath. Now, granted, if David wasn't on his rooftop, he wouldn't have seen her there. But maybe, and it was like, maybe she wasn't exactly innocently just taking her bath. She came to the king, which she had to. That wasn't like she came to the king and then she slept with him. Like, that seems like she meant to do it. No, she had to come see the king. Sleeping with him was a whole nother thing. But the story unfolds, and it takes, like I said, it takes two to dance. And I don't think David gets a lot of the rap, but we kind of leave Bathsheba alone. But this one, like I said, this guy that I was talking about indicated to me that Bathsheba is not necessarily innocent in this story. Could it have been that she was just taking her bath, didn't know David was even there, because the kings are supposed to be gone, right? So, but was she out in a place where somebody could have seen her, right? Because Uriah was gone, okay? Her husband, Uriah, is in David's army. And that's what makes this story even more interesting, okay? So now, he's not where he's supposed to be. He's slept with the wife of somebody in his army. And as we continue to kind of paraphrase the story, we're going to see now in verse 5 that Bathsheba becomes pregnant. So he's going to send for Uriah to come home to give him a rest, hoping that maybe he'll sleep with Bathsheba so he can pass off this pregnancy. But Uriah, being on duty pretty much, doesn't go home in verse 9, and he sleeps at the palace entrance. And so that's not what David wanted. So he summons Uriah again, and he's like, hey, what are you doing? And he's basically says, hey, you know what? This is what I'm supposed to do. And then as we see, he arranges for, he says, David tells him to do it again, but he still stays at the palace to help guard the king, because that's what he was doing. And then you'll see the header in the next handful of verses that says he arranges for Uriah's death. So he puts Uriah out there on the front line, and then he orders the rest of the army to retreat so that Uriah would be killed. So then he can take Bathsheba, as his wife. And it says there in verse 27, when a period of mourning was over, David sent for her to be brought to the palace, and she became one of his wives. And so, but it says here at the end, it says, but the Lord was displeased with what David had done. Now, here's the thing. The reason why I didn't go into too much detail, the reason why we really only read and focused on the boredom part, is that very first part. He's at the palace. He's not supposed to be. He's supposed to be out at war. All of this stuff. And the reason why, he taking a nap, and then he gets up, and he's just kind of wandering about, and he gets himself in trouble. That's what we want to focus on, because that's what boredom can do for us. That's why I said it's not the boredom part that's a sin. It's the choices that we make, the attitude that we might have. And so this is what David had done. And David added to it. He wound up sleeping with somebody that wasn't his wife. Then she winds up getting pregnant, or they wind up having a kid. And then also too, he tries to hide it. He tries to pawn it off onto Uriah, and then he can't do that. So then he has Uriah killed. And it's just the snowball effect, and we sometimes can do the same thing. Not murder, right? But we can get lulled into idleness, and we can get bored, and while what we do in our boredom, we try and find things to do, right? And that's where things can become addicting. That's where we can start to look at things we're not supposed to. That's where we can start to dabble in other things that we're not supposed to. And we can start having our actions, and we start become like nosy in other people's business. So Paul says it like this in 1 Timothy 5:13. It says, "Besides, they get into habit of being idle and going about from house to house. And not only do they become idlers, but they also become busybodies who talk nonsense, saying things they ought not to." So then you become like, because you're bored, you become maybe like this gossip kind of person, or do these different things. And this story in 2 Samuel 11:27 says at the end, "But the Lord was displeased with what David had done." And some of the time, I think that goes for us. Not some of the time, anytime we do something that we're not really supposed to do, whether it's out of boredom or just because we want to, right? The Lord is displeased with what we do. And that's why boredom is so hard, because everybody experiences. Everybody's going to get bored. I said I was going to reference the same story that we looked at last week when we talked about how guilt and shame and all of that, and fear and all these other emotions that we feel come into play, right? Adam and Eve. And I don't know, but like, I think they were possibly bored, right? They've done everything else in the garden. They're there to live forever and take care of the garden. That's all they're supposed to do, right? But as they went on and on, they started to kind of like, oh, well, we've already swam in this pond. We've already done this. We've already played with all the animals. We've taken care of all the trees. We've eaten from all the trees. Like, it's just, right? Just kind of like how we get sometimes, right? And you see in these stories where it's just kind of like, right, now I'm bored. And the whole idea of it is that Adam and Eve then did what God didn't want them to do. They ate from the tree, and their eyes were open, and they knew both good and evil. And that's how that story goes. And there's other stories in the Bible as well, where this kind of thing could be a hinge point. But these two stories in particular, right? Just boredom can get us in trouble. Boredom itself is not a problem, because sometimes it's just kind of like, it's just what happens sometimes. Like with me, like, I've got all this new, like I said earlier on in the episode, right? I've got a new PS5. I got all these kind of games that some of them I got for free and all this kind of stuff. And it's just kind of like, but I don't want to do any of that. I don't really want to watch Netflix. I don't really want to do, and you just kind of like, I don't, right? So how do we combat boredom? Because it can be a challenge, and a small amount of effort to try and do something else can be just going for a walk, right? Getting up, going for a walk, putting the phone down, whatever, getting off the computer or whatever we're doing here, right? We go for a walk, play with the dog, play with the kids. You can clean. You can read a book, spend time with friends, text somebody, call somebody, read or memorize some scripture. There's just a small little list of things, that we can do. Find something else to do. Because I know, once again, sometimes in our boredom, right, because we read that definition that says it's due to lack of mental stimulation, activities to do, or interest to do them, or interest in surroundings. So that's why I started off with go for a walk. Change the surroundings. Go to the park. Go to the whatever. Take the dog out. Whatever we have to do. right? And so then it says, following Jesus' example and serve other people, taking like a coffee or tea break with a friend, sending out encouraging text messages to people, seeing if anybody needs any help with anything. That's what Jesus constantly was doing. Can't really say Jesus was ever bored, but I can say he was busy, and he wasn't too busy enough to help other people, and he wasn't. But that's getting off into a rabbit trail. When I say look at Jesus' example, we're not looking at Jesus' example of that he was bored. We're looking at Jesus' example of the things that he did in his life that may help us combat boredom before we fall into some of these other kind of traps. One of them we're actually talking about next week, and I'm excited how this series kind of mapped out. Some of it was intentional, but some of it just kind of, hey, that worked out actually pretty good. It's of God. I say a lot when I plan these things, because I'm not fully planning them all by myself, right? So God has a lot to do with it, and God does things that I don't even know is coming. Just like this. I wanted to try and map this series out in a way that kind of build on each other, but that kind of go back to each other, and see how these emotions all kind of feed off of each other, right? And so sometimes in our boredom, we're gonna get what we're talking about next week, and I'm excited for it, because sometimes in our boredom we start to look at Facebook or other social media accounts, and we start seeing how other people have it, and we start seeing all of these things, and we become envious and jealous. And so we're going to talk about that. We're probably going to talk about a more unfamiliar story next week that I'm super, super excited about. So I hope you'll come back next week. I hope you'll go back and listen to some of our other episodes in this series, or other episodes that we've done this year or years prior. They are all available in our archive. But once again, to combat boredom, just find some things to do. Maybe have a go-to list. I don't know. Pick up the Bible and do some reading, or start texting some people some encouraging things, or try to find a way to get out of that boredom so we can stay clear. If David had maybe found some other things to do, and who's to say that he wasn't doing anything crazy, right? He was just out walking around on his rooftop. Who's to say Bathsheba was totally innocent, right? So the whole story can be said in many different kind of ways, but David just wasn't where he was supposed to be, and he needed other things to do, and so he wound up getting himself in trouble. And sometimes maybe we're not where we're supposed to be, and so we're bored, and we wind up getting ourselves in trouble as well. So finding some other things to do and stuff like that will be helpful. Whatever that might be for you. Like I said, cleaning, reading a book, sending those text messages to friends or family, seeing if anybody needs any help, seeing if anybody can get together for a cup of coffee or lunch or whatever. So I encourage you with that, and I encourage you to come back next week as we continue our series Inside Out. So we'll see you next week.